What does it take to function as a high priest? What are the criteria? Welcome to another tidbit from the Bible. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen, and we are studying the letter to the Hebrews, or the book of Hebrews. We have reached chapter 5. In the preceding verses in chapter 4, Jesus has been described as an efficient high priest who can sympathize with humans because he has been tried in everything, yet without sin. And as a result, you have this appeal, let us, verse 16 in chapter 4, let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we can receive mercy and find grace to help in our time of need. And then, in the first 10 verses of chapter 5, you have a theological reflection on the criteria for being a high priest. It begins with a description of the Aaronitic priesthood. Every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well for the sins of the people. No one takes this honor upon himself. He must be called by God just as Aaron was. And this description of the general priesthood is now repeated backwards in a chiastic fashion in relation to Christ. So Christ also did not take upon himself the glory of becoming a high priest. That is, he was called by God. God said to him, "You are my son, today I have become your father." Quoting from Psalm 2, describing the enthronement of the priestly king. And then another psalm quote is added. He says in another place, "You are priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." And more will be said about this topic as the epistle runs its course. And then there is a description of why Jesus and how Jesus can feel with those in trouble and why his sacrifice is efficient. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was son, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Now, several questions are raised to this particular text. The first one, was Jesus really hurt when he prayed? Did he ask to be delivered from death? But he died. And the answer to that question is, note that the reference is, in particular in verse 7, to the experience of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Here he struggled and finally prayed his prayer, "Your will be done." This is a prayer that was heard and fulfilled. And that leads us to the answer for the next question, that is, how is it possible for Jesus to learn obedience from what he suffered? Was he disobedient first? And it is true that when you and I learn obedience from what we suffer, it is very often because of our disobedience. We learn by our mistakes, we say, and some of us have ample opportunity to learn quite a lot because of many mistakes. That is not what is talked about here. This is Jesus learning from his temptations, his struggles, his sufferings, to be able, after this Garden of Gethsemane, to go through the climactic trial on the cross of Calvary. So the goal, what he accomplishes, is accomplished by his death on the cross. That is his sacrifice, and that sacrifice is efficient enough to qualify Jesus as a heavenly high priest, so he can complete all the promises of God, because now he is priest in the order of Melchizedek. And now you would suspect that the author would continue with describing what that means, this being a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. But he doesn't. Instead, you have once again an exhortation, which begins in 5:11 and which concludes in chapter 6:20. So this is a long exhortation. It has two parts. It has a very tough part, the warning, beginning here in verse 11, and it closes with the more positive part, the promise and the hope. And then in chapter 7, the author returns to the issue of priesthood in the order of Melchizedek. This whole exhortation is framed by a reference. Notice the final verse in chapter 6, verse 20. About Jesus, he has become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And then follows the reflection on why that Melchizedek pops up here. Now, let's read the final 4 verses in chapter 5. From verse 11, we have much to say about this. And that's what will come. But it's hard to explain because you're slow to learn. Sluggish is another word. In fact, through by this time you ought to be teachers. You need someone to teach you the elementary truth of God's word all over again. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness. But solid food is for the mature who, by constant use, have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. So, the audience is compared to babies when it comes to spiritual matters. They need to be re-educated. They need to go back to the basics and move on from there. This may be an exaggeration, but this is a preacher preaching. Certainly, he has their attention. And from that, he will move on with an even tougher warning, which we meet in chapter 6. And welcome back to the tidbit on chapter 6 from Hebrews. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen. Glad for you to listen.